Brooks Brothers, America's oldest clothing retailer, began in 1818 when Henry Sands Brooks opened a store at the corner of Cherry and Catherine Streets in Lower Manhattan. He was selling ready-to-wear clothing at a time when most Americans wore clothes made at home or by local tailors, and the idea was straightforward: good materials, reliable construction, available without a months-long wait. He died in 1833. His sons took over, renamed the business after their family, and kept going. By the time the company had dressed Abraham Lincoln at his first inaugural in 1861, and again at the theater in 1865, in a coat the Smithsonian now holds under museum-grade climate control, Brooks Brothers had become something specific in the American imagination. Not a luxury house in the European sense, something more American than that. The premise that quality could be assumed, that a well-made suit didn't need to announce itself, and that the price, while not cheap, was just the straightforward cost of a straightforward thing. While Ralph Lauren would later build an empire on aspiration, Brooks Brothers had always sold assumption. Where J. Press and the broader Ivy League-style tradition offered variations on the same natural shoulder ethos, Brooks Brothers was the origin point, the brand that defined what preppy fashion actually meant before anyone called it that. That premise held for a long time. For most of the 20th century, Brooks Brothers manufactured its clothing in the United States. Made in USA wasn't a marketing claim. It was simply a description of where the clothes came from. The specific geography shifted as the decades passed, from New York in the early years into New England and the American Southeast as labor costs and real estate changed. But the domestic production was real, and it was central to what the company was. Materials were sourced with care. Construction methods had been developed and refined over generations, and the people doing the work carried that practice in their hands. The standard in a Brooks Brothers suit through much of this period was a full canvas chest. It's a structure built from layers of natural materials: horsehair interlining, wool canvas, cotton, hand-tacked to the outer shell of the jacket in a specific sequence, then shaped by pressing at intervals through the construction. The result moves with the body because the internal structure is flexible. Over years of wear, a canvassed chest continues to conform to the wearer's shape, which means the jacket fits better the longer you own it. The fused alternative, bonding the chest layers with heat-activated adhesive, had been technically possible since the 1950s and was adopted through the 70s and 80s by most of the mainstream apparel industry. It was faster, considerably cheaper, and for the first few years of a jacket's life, largely indistinguishable from canvas. Brooks Brothers used fused construction in some of its lower-price garments. In its American-made tailored clothing, for a long time, it didn't. The Southwick factory in Haverhill, Massachusetts, had been producing suits since 1929. Before it became part of the Brooks Brothers operation, Southwick had its own history, manufacturing clothing for multiple retailers and under its own name, with ties to the natural shoulder tradition that J. Press and its peers had helped define. And the Haverhill facility represented a specific kind of accumulated expertise that doesn't transfer easily. Setting a sleeve at the correct pitch so it holds its shape through repeated dry cleaning. working a collar so it lies flat in cold weather and warm, underpressing each seam between construction steps in the exact sequence that determines how the fabric behaves a decade later. These are skills that take years to develop. They don't live in a manual in any practically useful form. They live in the hands and eyes of the people who do the work, and they pass from experienced workers to less experienced ones through proximity and repetition over a long time. At its peak, the Haverhill facility employed several hundred people. Some of them had worked there for 20 or 30 years, and some were the children of people who'd worked there before them. The plant wasn't glamorous. Nobody in the business press was writing about these workers. But what they were doing was precisely the work that justified the price on the label and the association with quality that the Brooks Brothers name had carried for a century and a half. In 1988, Marks & Spencer acquired Brooks Brothers for approximately $750 million. The British retailer had been expanding internationally, and it saw the purchase as both a foothold in the American market and a platform for broader growth. The strategic logic was coherent. The execution was something else. Marks & Spencer's retail model and corporate culture had limited overlap with what Brooks Brothers actually was, and the attempts to adapt M&S's operational approach to the American brand produced results that neither the existing customer base nor a new one found particularly compelling. Through the 90s, the domestic manufacturing footprint began to contract. Not quickly, and not with any announcement. The changes happened incrementally, each one small enough that it didn't register as a moment in any narrative. Offshore sourcing increased, and the factories that remained open continued to operate and continued to appear in the company's marketing. The Made in USA designation, which had been a baseline feature of the American-made lines, not a premium marker, but simply a description of where the clothes came from, shifted in meaning during this period. It came to identify specific product lines and price points within the broader range, rather than characterizing the range as a whole. The base of the line had moved. The communication hadn't. The trade environment was accelerating this. NAFTA, which took effect in 1994, restructured North American apparel production. China's entry into the WTO in 2001 opened another front entirely, and the labor cost differential between American facilities and offshore manufacturers became, over the course of that decade, very difficult to argue around in any boardroom. The fast fashion model, H&M, and later the even lower cost operators, was demonstrating that consumers would accept offshore production at virtually every price point. The pressure moved up the market from the bottom. The customer walking into a Brooks Brothers store in 1998 and buying a suit was, in most cases, receiving a garment constructed differently from what the same store would have sold them in 1978. Nothing on the label said so. The label said what it had always said. The store looked the way it had always looked, and the salespeople talked about heritage and quality. The differences were real, detectable to anyone who knew what to look for, and invisible to everyone else. Marks & Spencer sold Brooks Brothers in 2001 to Retail Brand Alliance, a private equity vehicle. The sale price was lower than what M&S had paid. Southwick in Haverhill closed in 2014. The company issued a statement about manufacturing economics and the changing realities of the global apparel supply chain, and the statement was accurate in what it said. It described a decision that had become economically inevitable because the economics were real. Domestic apparel manufacturing had been under pressure from offshore production for decades, and by 2014, the arithmetic was difficult to argue around. Labor costs in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and China were a fraction of American rates, and the quality differential that had once justified the domestic premium had, in many product categories, narrowed as offshore manufacturers improved their methods. What the statement didn't address was the preceding 20 years. The decision to close Southwick in 2014 wasn't a decision made in 2014. It was the conclusion of a process that had begun well before, in which domestic production had been progressively reduced, the product mix had shifted toward offshore sourcing, and what remained of American manufacturing had become a smaller and smaller portion of a larger, more globally dispersed operation. The closure formalized something that had already substantially occurred. The Garland, North Carolina facility, which had been producing suits and sport coats for Brooks Brothers since the 1980s, closed in 2017. At its peak, it had employed around 300 people. The announcement was local news for a few days, and then it wasn't news. By 2020, the Brooks Brothers product line was manufactured primarily outside the United States. Suits were produced in Italy, Portugal, and various countries in Asia, depending on the price tier. The company still had a domestic shirt operation in Haverhill, in a facility separate from the old Southwick building, which had already been repurposed, that produced dress shirts marketed as American-made. Those shirts cost meaningfully more than the imported ones, and some customers bought them specifically for that reason. The company at that point had roughly 500 retail locations and licensing agreements covering more than 40 countries. It had spent the preceding decade trying to resolve an ongoing strategic question. What does Brooks Brothers sell when the American professional wardrobe is casualizing? When the suit is no longer the default uniform of office life? When the customer the brand was built around is wearing chinos and a button-down on days he'd have worn a suit 20 years earlier? Revised fit profiles, younger designers, expanded casual and women's lines, accessories, collaborations. These produced incremental results, but no clear resolution. The brand remained associated in the public imagination with formal business clothing in a world that was buying less of it. Then the COVID-19 pandemic arrived and closed the stores in March of 2020. Suits stopped selling because offices closed, and the entire category of formal business clothing collapsed simultaneously at every price point across every brand in a matter of weeks. For a company that had spent years trying and failing to diversify away from that category, there was no revenue source to absorb the loss. Brooks Brothers filed for Chapter 11. Protection on July 8, 2020. Several parties expressed interest in the bankruptcy process. The winning bid came from Spark Group, a joint venture between Authentic Brands Group and Simon Property Group, who paid approximately $325 million. The transaction closed in late 2020. Authentic Brands Group at the time managed a portfolio that included 9 West, Barney's New York, and a collection of other brand names in various states of commercial activity, a company whose core business is managing and licensing intellectual property attached to names that still carry cultural recognition. What transferred in the transaction was intellectual property: the name, the Golden Fleece trademark, the design archives, the retail leases, the inventory. The manufacturing operations had closed before the bankruptcy, so there was nothing to transfer. This is the detail that the bankruptcy coverage tended to pass over quickly, because by the time the bankruptcy made the news, the manufacturing story was already over. The factories had closed years earlier. The workers who'd spent careers developing specific expertise in American suit and shirt production had left the industry when their plants shut. There was no systematic documentation of what they knew, no effort to preserve the institutional knowledge of how to construct a canvassed chest or how to set a collar in the particular way that a specific combination of material weight and construction technique required. The knowledge wasn't catalogued. It was practiced until the practice stopped, and then it was gone. Some of those workers found employment in other parts of the textile and apparel sector. Some retired. The sector itself had contracted considerably. American apparel manufacturing employment, which had stood at around 900,000 jobs in 1990, had fallen to a fraction of that by 2020. Brooks Brothers wasn't the cause of that decline. It was one instance of a pattern that had been underway for decades, shaped by NAFTA, China's WTO accession, global labor markets, and the choices of retailers and brands responding to competitive pressure. The Haverhill and Garland closures weren't exceptional events. They were ordinary. That's precisely what made them easy to miss. Brooks Brothers continues to operate under Spark Group's management. The Madison Avenue flagship is open. New product lines have been introduced, older ones continued, and the website offers suits, dress shirts, neckwear, sport coats, and the full range of products the company has always sold. The construction in the current tailored clothing reflects industry practice at the relevant price points, and some of it is better than the segment average. The Golden Fleece appears on every storefront, as it has since 1850. The last domestic manufacturing facility, the Haverhill shirt operation, closed in 2020.